it can be quite a revelation to people when they do philosophy to discover that it is connected with other modes of thought, and that it does make them clearer, and it does help them to, at least to see where the ultimate questions about any discipline lie. It at least teaches them to think, but more than that, I think it teaches them to ask fundamental questions. They question things they've taken for granted. So I think it encourages a healthy skepticism. I don't mean disbelief, I mean critical examination of your own thoughts. And that I think is a very good thing, because quite a lot of education is the implanting of ideas which are not really assimilated, but just taken over by a pupil. And I think philosophy at least ought to combat that. Whether it always does is another matter. I read philosophy with ancient history in completing the course just after the war. And actually then I didn't really like philosophy very much. I much preferred the history, because it was more concrete, and I felt lost in philosophy. And I only really began to like it right at the end of the time when I was studying it. In fact, really, after I'd taken my final schools. For I've realized then that it was about things which had, in a way, always interested me. And then I took it up as a graduate. And that was a kind of accident. I mean, it happened through an accident. That is to say, I had an accident and broke my leg and had to go into hospital. And when I was being taken into hospital, I just picked up the first book that lay ready to hand, and it was Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And I read it for the first time, and was absolutely caught by it. I thought it was terrific. And it was at that moment that I really decided to go on doing philosophy. And when I came out of hospital, I went back to Baylor as a graduate. My main interest really is the philosophy of mind, and that, of course, is connected with later Wittgenstein, because a large part of Wittgenstein's later work was in the philosophy of mind. The only two books that I've written are one about Russell and one about Wittgenstein. And the book on Wittgenstein is an entirely general book in the Modern Masters series, and it's divided between early and late Wittgenstein, and just gives a very brief survey of the development of his philosophy. I am actually working on a much more elaborate book on Wittgenstein, on the early philosophy, with Brian McGuinness of Queen's College here in Oxford, and that's on Wittgenstein's early philosophy. And I've always been fascinated by Wittgenstein. In fact, I think, to me, he's been the most fascinating of all philosophers, I mean, of all time. I did actually see him once, back view, walking down the street in an old Macintosh and a tweed cap. I didn't know who it was, and I was told afterwards by, I think, Isaiah Berlin, that it was Wittgenstein. That was the only time I ever saw him, receding into the distance in improbable clothes. Well, freedom of the will is an enormous subject, and we have a lot of really quite separate questions to discuss. I think we might arrange this tutorial around the idea of the detached will. Now, there are various senses of the phrase detached will, and one of the things that it is at issue in that conversation between Hampshire and Iris Murdoch is the question whether your will is detached from the information which is fed to it, and in particular, whether, given information about yourself, that you're likely to do a certain kind of thing in a certain kind of situation, you can always step back and take a fresh decision. Another rather different issue is whether your will in any way affects the information that you receive. I don't mean by wishful thinking, but by deliberately and consciously changing your view, say, of a person. I mean, this is a thing which does occur in personal relations, and which is discussed in Iris Murdoch's essay, The Idea of Perfection. And a third, quite different sense in which the will might be said to be detached is the way in which in early existentialist writing, I mean in the work of Sartre, the will is said to be detached from any value system, any system of value judgments, so that man has an entirely free option what set of value judgments to adopt. Indeed, in the extreme version of his theory, he adopts his value judgments in a sort of void. Now, I thought we might discuss those three questions, and perhaps we might begin with Hampshire's ideas in his book Freedom and the Individual.
I gather that his idea is that the...
I've always been based on Oxford. and I've taught in many places in America. I mean, the situation in England has been totally different from the situation in America, where people move around really very frequently. I mean, so that it's sometimes quite difficult to remember one's friends' addresses in America. But in England, people don't move so much, or haven't until recently. But now they do move more than they did. I'm glad to say it is breaking up, because I think it's a very bad thing if everybody is educated in a single tradition and then goes on teaching in that tradition, because of course it leads to isolation from anything that's happening outside. Very few undergraduates go on even to do philosophy as graduates, and of course it's combined, as it is in America, with other subjects. So I suppose the main part it plays in education for undergraduates in Oxford is as a subject to be read with other subjects. And then, of course, that's a very different approach from if you specialise in it entirely as you do as a graduate. We do it here historically, and I think it's very salutary to know quite a lot about the history of ideas, particularly in philosophy, which always suffers from a tendency to follow the latest fashion.
But it only increases one's freedom of action if one assumes that one's got freedom of action, that determinism is not in fact true.
Yes, but then...
So he's got to argue completely within that context.
But then, at this point, oughtn't we to divide up the word free a bit?
Yes.
And,
okay,
I mean,
say freedom given that we aren't in fact determined.
I mean, one doesn't want to make freedom an all or nothing matter.
No.
I mean, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that determinism is true, and that if freedom is opposed to determinism, people aren't free. Nevertheless, within this general picture of bondage,
we've got
there might be various other freedoms which people could exercise.
Yes.
And I would have thought that's one valid point, really. The point that the more people know about themselves, the greater their freedom within this limited area.
Yes.
Well, that's the point, of course, on which Iris Murdoch and Stuart Hampshire disagree in that conversation.
Yes.
What is the difference exactly?
Iris Murdoch's view of the free will is this constant process by which one's reviewing all one's mental facts and desires, rather than only at moments of decision which are going to come out into actions. I think the importance of this is that it means that one's morality has got to be attached to one's whole life, one's whole mental life, rather than just one's actions or even one's decisions which don't result in actions.
Well, as you rightly say, the difference between Hampshire's and Iris Murdoch's views is this, that Hampshire is much more interested in the actual moment of decision to act, whereas Iris Murdoch is interested in the continual process of trying to alter one's mental attitude, and particularly in personal relations, one's attitude to people. I mean, the main point she's making in the passages that you talk about in your essay is that a person can and should use his will to modify his attitude. But now, there is of course the question, which she doesn't discuss in her essay, the question whether, if determinism is true, any kind of free will is reconcilable with it. Now, she doesn't discuss it, but I think perhaps it's a question that we now ought to go on to discuss. I mean, take a case where you wouldn't blame somebody for doing something. Say they were in the grip of violent passion, or an addict who was unable to resist the temptation to go get another fix. But in that latter case, you might well say the blame was inappropriate.
Yeah.
The question why? A plausible answer is because he couldn't have acted otherwise.
But surely not in the determinist sense, if he couldn't have acted otherwise.
Well, you may be right in saying that, but then you've got to distinguish between the determinist sense, if he couldn't have acted otherwise, and the sense which is a reasonable basis for blame. I mean, for withholding blame.
I would have thought that one could distinguish quite effectively between the case of the determinist sense of freedom and our normal sense of freedom, and attach moral blame and praise to our sense of freedom in a way which wouldn't be affected by the possible truth of determinism. If you take the example of two men who both want to have a drink and both decide that they will have a drink, one of them being an alcoholic and the other one just an ordinary man who thinks perhaps he'd like to have a drink. But in the case of the alcoholic, we would not blame him, even if we knew that he shouldn't have had a drink, even if he knew that he shouldn't have had a drink. we say he was an alcoholic, he couldn't help it. He had his drink. But in the case of the other man, who may have said, well, I shouldn't have a drink, I know, but I'm going to, we would blame him and say he was morally responsible for his actions when he was drunk afterwards. Whereas the determinist would say of both of them, completely indistinguishably, neither of them could help it. And it's very important that we're able to preserve a distinction between our meaning of he couldn't help it in the sense that he couldn't help it for some reason such as that he was an alcoholic, or any sort of physical coercion, or that he was in the grip of some violent passion which we understand. I mean, one excuses people perhaps for attacking when they discover their wife's lovers in bed, because that's the sort of violent passion which we can understand and we excuse sometimes. But the determinist can make no such distinctions.
Well, he can draw the distinction in theory. The question is what use ought one to make of it when drawn, you see. Now, it seems to me that the determinist can perfectly well distinguish between these two cases. I mean, the case of the man who just goes into a pub, has one drink too many, comes out and has a motor accident, and the case of the alcoholic, who's absolutely trapped, pushed by a desire to drink, with which he doesn't identify himself. Now, of course, we may say that the first man is to blame, and the second man is not to blame, because the second man is incapable of acting otherwise in some narrower sense of incapable of acting otherwise than the general inevitability of the determinist. But really it's a question of value judgment, because I think what you have to do is to show that it's just to blame the first man and not just to blame the second man. I first met Iris Murdoch in 1949 when she came back to Oxford from Cambridge, and I think very shortly after that was appointed tutor at Dan's, where she taught for many years. And she then taught at the Royal College of Art for a time, and did give, I think, more than one course in aesthetics. I think she's never written on aesthetics, not to my knowledge anyway, but it certainly is an interest of hers. I think that what has happened in British moral philosophy in this century and up till really quite recently is that it has been pursued in too abstract a way. So I think that anybody who is interested in human character and actual human predicaments as a novelist, like Murdoch, of course, is, does approach ethics in a much more concrete and a much fuller and richer way, say, than people who are merely interested in the abstract structure of ethical systems without any regard for their content. I mean, the relationship between her philosophy and her novels, well, the philosophy appears in her novels. Whether the fact that she's a novelist appears in her philosophy, I'm not sure really. Certainly to this extent, that those two interests in philosophy, ethics and the philosophy of mind, are of course precisely the interests which you'd expect a novelist to have, and possibly also politics. And this is certainly noticeable in her essays in that book of hers. I mean, yes, Sovereignty of Good, I mean, for instance, the essay which gives the book its title, is a very clear example of that. Well, let's not discuss determinism anyway yet, or the possibility of reconciling freedom of the will with determinism, because that's such a complicated and difficult subject. Let's go further back and ask about moral freedom in what it manifests itself. I mean, whether it's in actions or in something more than actions, and generally what the scope of moral freedom is.
Yes, I think there is a problem about the nature of the will, which I feel certainly unclear about, which I'd like to talk about a little later, but I think it might be a good idea to start in a simpler way, talking about what sort of thing freedom appears to be, what sort of moments we might experience exercising our will, or exercising our freedom, or enjoying our freedom, and meaning, of course, not anything to do with political freedom here. One's not concerned at the moment with questions of political liberty and whether you can, in some political or physical sense, do something, leave the country or something. We're talking about what goes on in the mind when we make choices and when we are working as moral agents. And part of our problem, I think, is to decide whether one can isolate certain activities as moral activities. I mean, this will relate, I think, to the problem about the will, which we want to discuss. But perhaps we might start by talking about and thinking in a very broad way about what experiences of freedom are like. When is one making free choices?
I think the simplest case, and the most obvious one that jumps to mind first, is a case where somebody decides what to do. I mean, whether it's a particular action or perhaps something much more general like the choice of a career. And in such situations, people do feel that they're making a free choice, and that is that they're not trapped, coerced, forced by any other factors, and they simply choose of their own free will to do whatever it is they do choose to do. And those, I think, are the paradigm cases which one might start.
Yes, certainly. I mean, it may be that experience of freedom is something which belongs in certain areas of human life and not in others, and I suspect that the kind of emphasis on freedom as an experience, which we're so familiar with in moral philosophy now, isn't perhaps always with us, not even always with us in philosophy. I mean, it's something on which great emphasis has been laid, certainly since human Kant, perhaps for reasons connected with the change of relation of the individual to society. I mean, what the causes are for changes of this kind also, I think, doesn't here concern us, but I think it's noteworthy that people, as between one society and another, and I think also as between one individual person and another, differ very much in their interest in experiences of freedom. I mean, I agree with you that, for instance, very dramatic experiences come to us all when perhaps there's a great parting of the ways in our lives. I mean, when I marry so-and-so and decide to live in America, or shall I not do so and stay in England, or shall I take up this career or that career? I mean, these are moments when one has this rather unnerving feeling of mustering reasons and examining motives, and one's already got these two terms which arise so naturally in this context, and very often feeling, and this is the thing which of course existentialist philosophers like to emphasize, that there's no really very clear reason or motive for doing A rather than B. But then of course there are, which one is experiencing all the time I suppose, often without concentrating attention upon it, much more undramatic examples, aren't there, of free choices.
Do you think that one can say truly that a person is free to not just to control, say, a feeling like anger, not give vent to it, but actually free to alter his own feelings about another person, say, to eliminate a feeling of resentment? Because, I mean, if that were so, that would considerably extend the scope of moral freedom.
Well, I certainly think this, yes. How much emphasis one puts in a particular case on a man's ability to alter the pattern of his feelings, I think would just depend on the case. But I think common sense would agree that, and I think would rightly hold that one is responsible for instance, harbouring resentment, encouraging a feeling of resentment, as opposed to attempting to eliminate it. Even feeling anxiety could be regarded as something over which we have control, and control which we should exercise. But this matter of feelings, which we've already started to talk about, hasn't of course always been in the forefront, or indeed in some cases anywhere at all in the discussion of freedom, because some philosophers have thought that the world of feelings and emotions could, and Kant of course thought should, be in some way amputated from this discussion. But perhaps we could talk for a moment about Hume, because the beginning of the whole problem that interests us at the moment anyway, can be seen as finding its origin perhaps in Hume, and well, I just said I personally find Hume a very sympathetic philosopher in many ways, because he's so enormously realistic about the very deep origins of personality and the very great difficulty there is in altering patterns of feeling. Well, impossibility, really. I suppose Hume, in a rather, seems to be a rather casual way, is a determinist. That is, he doesn't really worry about this problem. He just assumes that, of course, we have very deep roots in our personality, which are affecting what we do. And he is, of course, a sort of Tory. I mean, he is one of the ancestors of British Toryism. I mean, he's a man who believes in tradition and not upsetting tradition by exercises of reason, which will, according to him, be quite fruitless anyway.
Yes, there's really an enormous distinction between the way in which Kant and the way in which Hume thought of morality. I mean, for Hume it was based on feeling and a natural development of perfectly ordinary human feelings. For Kant it was totally different. I mean, he thought the difference between what was morally right and morally wrong was based on the exercise of reason and had nothing to do with feelings. In fact, he denigrates feelings and says they're merely pathological and really nothing to do with morality at all. There is another very fundamental point in most English moral philosophy since about 1900, and that is the pushing through of the distinction between fact and value absolutely to the extreme, so that ideally you'd have on the one side purely neutral information with no tinge of valuation in it, which is just fed into the mind, and then the person, the agent in a moral predicament, collects all this information, and then quite separately and mysteriously, as it were out of the blue, he produces a value judgment on it. And I think that a great deal of recent moral philosophy has been dominated by a very rigid and extreme version of this distinction. And well, I mean, not only in England, but also in the early writing of Sartre.
Yes.
I mean, but according to Sartre, one chooses in a void I mean, that comes about because when a person makes a choice, he makes it with reference to a moral system, but then the idea is he has to have chosen that, I mean, the system. And how does he choose it?
Yes, one sees, of course, partly what the motives are for the tremendous emphasis on the distinction between fact and value, that one of the more appealing and plausible motives is to ensure, as it were, that the agent shall be regarded as totally free. This, I think, is a part of a very deep movement of thought away from religion, really. I mean, Kant, of course, is a very highly religious man, and he felt that what he was doing was in some sense safeguarding religion, because he was making it a matter of faith and somehow separating it from the world of institutions and the world of tradition, which Hume is so deep in and which Hume values. I mean, I think that there's a very deep conflict between people who trust tradition and people who are frightened of tradition and frightened of institutions. I mean, that Kant is a man who fears that the human will and the human individual will be dominated by something or other, something external.
Very true. I think that one of the motives for pushing the fact-value distinction to an extreme is distrust of established values.
Yes.
I mean, the good side of it is that it leads people to review their value system, ask themselves whether they really subscribe.
Yes, I mean, the kind of situation that Kant would be safeguarding one against, and this is true also of course, of Sartre and of philosophers like Hare, who are the modern Kantians, would be the case where you're told what to do by the priest.
And not only a priest, but Christ.
Yes.
I mean, Kant said that about Christ.
Yes, this is
one
very...
should judge Christ by the image of the ideal which you
this
have in
is a
your
very
own.
moving, I think, and a significant passage in Kant, where he says you must step back even from the image of Christ and consult what you've got inside you. No philosopher really gives one an entirely satisfactory picture. I mean, I think it would be impossible perhaps to be a great philosopher and to give a really comprehensive view of the human situation. Well, I mean, why? I mean, the answer to this question is a very complicated one too, but because great philosophers have a certain very strong vision of the human setup and are inspired by this, and this almost always means they neglect something or other, but I feel great sympathy with roughly the Marxist vision, because it emphasizes the non-solitariness of the individual, the way in fact you're sunk in history, you're sunk in a world that you haven't chosen and that you can't dominate, and which moves you. And a lot of your freedom, my own personal view of freedom, would be a function of recognizing this fact in one way or another, that there's not very much you can do with what you're given, and devising methods of making small alterations in your relation to the data of your situation is a very important part of the moral life, in fact probably most of it.
One of the things which people have objected to in recent English moral philosophy is just the extreme emptiness of it. I mean, I don't mean that emptiness is necessarily a bad thing, but one can see why people object to it. I mean, moral systems are offered absolutely in the abstract. I mean, it's the logic of a moral system with no content whatsoever. And of course that's connected very closely with the development of the fact-value distinction to an extreme.
Yes.
And I think that what many people have found unsatisfying about English moral philosophy in the last 50 years is just this insistence that all you can do is study the logic of ethics, where the logic of ethics is absolutely abstract and empty with no ideal built into it.
Yes.
I mean, it may be a good thing to make that point, but this is the ideal limit. To go on insisting on it, particularly to the young, I mean, undergraduates, I mean, is something which is, well, more than boring.
Yes, and which causes a crisis of confidence, yes. I think that there's an interesting, perhaps political background to this in England, partly a sort of perhaps unconscious one, that our political tradition is so empiricist and ad hoc and anti-theoretical, that I think that many philosophers have felt, I mean, just as with Sartre, I mean, I think he's very much influenced, both in his early and in his later philosophy, by very deep political convictions that many philosophers, I think, have felt that they were in some way defending something which was politically important.
But by insisting on freedom to choose.
Yes, by insisting, by rejecting general theories, or rejecting any kind of general theory which attaches us to a strong background of any sort. And it's interesting that even, I mean, one might say, well, why isn't there a development of Hume in England into some very strong, as it were, conservative theorizing?
But you're suggesting that's because of a native English distrust of theory?
Well, I think that's one reason, yes.
And a sort of predilection for empiricism.
Yes, though what, again, what the reason for that is, raises further questions. But I mean, I think this is a fact of our atmosphere of thought in this country. This absence of background in our thinking about politics, for instance, in this country, which curiously combines a sort of acceptance of tradition, acceptance of Hume's notion of a sort of uncomplicated kind of natural tradition, with free-thinking, empiricist radicalism, as it were. This goes very naturally with a kind of philosophy which is, as you said, clean, as it were, which a kind of philosophy which, at a certain stage, emerges from certain attitudes in science, the notion that one can be perfectly clear, at least about the facts, and there's no, as it were, sinister influence in the background. There's nothing metaphysical or peculiar which one's going to come up against as an absolute barrier to what you want to do. And I think that this is a continuation, really, of the kind of view which we find in Hume and again in Mill, that whatever anybody's likely to think about morals is going to be more or less okay. I mean, one might say it's a sort of pre-Hitler view. It's a view which goes with our sort of 19th century optimism and a feeling of progress, and a feeling that people are fundamentally decent chaps, a view which, after recent history, I think, one cannot in general take. But we were thinking, you said that one could contrast a view of the will which attempts to separate it from its background with views which fill in a powerful background. And one might here think not only of Marx, but of course of Freud, who very much pictures the soul or self as filled in. That is a very dense system that one sees moral judgment and action as emerging from. Thinking of Freud as a scientist, I mean, there is a great discovery which Freud has made. There are many people in different ways knew these things before. I mean, many artists, of course, knew that there was that the mind could be thought of as a reservoir or a dark place out of which these very powerful patterns emerge. I feel that Freud is a great scientist, and that he has found a scientific terminology. He's found a scientific vocabulary and way of dealing with something which has only been vaguely known about before. He's a great discoverer. But I feel insofar as he's sometimes made by his followers into a kind of metaphysician, where his view is used to impose as universal certain sorts of patterns. I mean, he partly, of course, I suppose, asks for this particular treatment. It's too specialized a view of the mind, it seems to me. I mean, that I see no reason why one should make as many assumptions as Freudians do make about the mind. And also this raises, of course, which we have been avoiding so far, the whole question of determinism and whether, to what extent one should regard the mind as a complete system of machinery. I mean, I would certainly feel that one must, just from a realistic point of view, regard the mind to some extent as a sort of machine. I mean, there are elements of machine-like movement which one constantly discovers in oneself, but I think these are very, very various, and I certainly wouldn't regard this as part of a general argument for determinism, and I don't feel, I feel only modified sympathy with the kind of machinery that Freud wishes to set up in the background. That is, I have here the reaction which the Kantian philosopher has of wanting to step back and say, I'm not compelled by anything that you are showing to me.
Well, Freud, yes, I mean, to bring Freud in raises all sorts of questions.
Yes.
I mean, and Freud's theory is related to the things we've been discussing in a variety of ways. And first of all, the last way you mentioned, Freud obviously was a determinist.
Yes, I suppose so.
And that raises the question how he could believe in any kind of freedom.
There is a metaphysical element here, isn't there, in that also it seems to me, I mean, that is, he's not purely a scientist, he's also a metaphysician, in that he makes a certain kind of choice, which doesn't seem to me to have a scientific justification, of an ideal human nature, that the ideal man is neurotic, for instance, and has certain kind of way of moving.
Something that many moral philosophers have done, I mean, in different, less complicated ways.
Yes, and this is true. I mean, that an ideal man is chosen and imposed is true even of the so-called sterile ones, such as Richard Hare.
Yes, but I mean, Aristotle, for example, has a view of the ideal life based on observation of how men actually live.
Yes, but Aristotle is more out in the open about it in some way. I mean, he's.
You mean Freud claims illegitimate scientific support for what he says?
I would feel so. Yes. I mean, it's impossible. Of course, any moral philosopher who's worth reading, of course, has got an ideal picture of human nature. And I mean, I don't object to this per se. I mean, I have got one myself. I mean, insofar as one is arguing seriously, I think you can't help having, you can't help your general values about what you think a good human being is like coming into the picture. But I think one must, as it were, come clean about this, and not, I mean, Freud is doing the thing, well, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not an expert on Freud. I mean, I just speak as I've never been analysed, and I don't really, perhaps in that sense, know the thing from the inside. I've only read a certain amount of Freud, but it seems to me he does what many philosophers, Moore, for instance, when he talked about the naturalistic fallacy, what many philosophers object to, that is, introducing a different kind of argument, an argument which seems to have overriding power, in this case a scientific argument or a pseudo-scientific argument, to persuade one that one has no choice but to regard the matter in this particular light.
You mean the determinism, the general determinism?
Well, I was thinking more of the ideal picture and of theories about neurosis and the origin of neurosis. I mean, I feel that part of the charm of psychoanalytic theory, and this goes very much for Jung, I think, as well as Freud, is that it's so pictorial and dramatic. I think Wittgenstein somewhere says something interesting on this point, that you like to think of your life as a story. I mean, that one likes myths, and one likes to feel, I think it's very consoling to feel, when one's made a mess of things, that there's a deep pattern to it. I mean, obviously blaming your father or something like this is an instinctive human reaction anyway, and if this is given a scientific background, of course this can actually be therapeutic, because it cheers you up through making you feel that what you're doing is what everybody does.
So it's a useful myth.
It's a useful myth.
Not to be judged as true or false science.
Well, this is a delicate point, isn't it? I mean, if the point of the thing is therapy, and the therapy works, then the science works. But as a sort of metaphysical theory, it's not just a matter of therapy, it's a matter of a particular view of human nature.
Well, I know we do disagree on Freud, and I think the main point on which we disagree is that I don't regard the Freud system as quite so unscientific as you do. I think when you call it a metaphysical system, you regard his ethical views as somehow more a priori than those of most moral philosophers. But actually, I mean, the most general basis is that he's appealing to the fact that conflict produces unhappiness. And this is an empirical fact, and then more specifically that certain types of conflict produce unhappiness and illness. And if this is true, then of course it is a very good basis for the thesis that that kind of conflict should be eliminated. And that leads straight into a moral system which puts value on certain human impulses and thinks that they should be given at least due freedom to express themselves in natural actions. And that seems to me to be not a priori or metaphysical, but simply, I mean, it is in a very ancient tradition of moral philosophy that if you want to see how people ought to live, you observe how people do succeed in living happily.
Yes, I mean, his theories about the origins of neurosis, I mean, are scientific theories, and I mean, this, I'm sure, is the great part of his work. But I'm worried both by the myths he uses. I mean, I think that he uses certain kinds of myths to the exclusion of other equally possible mythological ways of looking at your life, either for purposes of therapy or just for purposes of well, I mean, one uses myths in one's life. I mean, some people imagine they're Napoleon or something. One uses myths in one's life for all sorts of reasons, cheer oneself up and get along through life. And sometimes these myths have the result of making you a more successful person. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're quite neutral. I think I'm worried partly by the restriction of the mythological aspect, and also by assumptions about, for instance, the importance of overcoming conflicts, the importance of being a good specimen or a good sort of running concern, as it were, as a human being in a certain sort of way.
When you put it like that, it makes it sound as if the point of being a good specimen is that you're useful to somebody else. But I mean, it might have some point for the person himself.
Oh well, I'm sure it has an enormous point. Yes, I mean, but this is putting. I mean, this could be developed as a kind of utilitarian naturalism. That it is there is a sort of norm of humanity which is well balanced and happy, and it's certainly arguable that such a person is not only more content with himself, but is a better citizen and a better father, and so on. I mean, I think this is true, but to make this into a kind of ultimate judgment, this is what I would object to. I mean, to put it quite simply, I mean, I think there are many people who ought to be in a state of anxiety, conflict, neurosis.
Why?
Well, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, if for instance, your choice is to go on struggling as an artist and making yourself miserable, and perhaps making your family miserable.
Oh, I see. You mean if the person himself chooses this life in full knowledge, it's one thing to put forward as an ideal the avoidance of extreme misery and extreme conflict, I mean, which of course results in a sort of totally ineffectual life. And that's one thing. But what you're saying is that in order to do that, one doesn't have to put forward a positive ideal, which would make everybody at the best much the same. You're saying that people should have the choice, really.
Yes, I'm not even so much concerned. I mean, I don't know that Freud would necessarily bring about people being much the same, except in these respects of being workable, in a certain sense of workable. I mean, of course.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
But it seems to me to be a good thing that one's feelings should be directed exclusively onto their objects and not be transferred from some obscure thing about which one knows very little in one's early life.
But here you're making a Freudian assumption which I reject.
Oh, you think that's not true?
Well, I mean, you're implying that where people have objectives which bring about anxiety and misery. These are in some sense false objectives, behind which the true but hidden objectives lie. I would deny
Not
this.
always, but quite often I think that is so, and demonstrably so in individual cases.
I think it's sometimes so, yes, but
But if that is so, then you surely wouldn't want anybody to remain in that state, however fruitful.
I'm not
productive.
sure about this. I think it's sometimes too readily assumed that a certain kind of self-knowledge is self-evidently worth having, perhaps at the price of surrendering other things. I mean, this the philosophy of Stuart Hampshire, I think, makes a very interesting use of this idea that self-knowledge thought of very roughly in relation to the kinds of things that Freud, for instance, discovers, is not only an extension of one's freedom, which in certain respects it clearly is. I mean, if you know that you have a certain kind of neurosis, you can decide whether you're going to conquer it, for instance, or not, and you may know how to conquer it. Try to conquer it, yes. Not only an extension of your freedom, but also something in itself desirable. I mean, this is something which has always worried me, ever since, if one thinks of Socrates saying that one must know oneself, it depends what this means. I mean, this is one of the things that would worry me about having too much of a reliance on or faith in Freud, that you've got a particular image of self-knowledge offered here. And I'm not sure that there aren't many different kinds of self-knowledge, and also that there mightn't be cases where you'd approve of the man who didn't bother about this at all.
Well, I think Hampshire's talking about a person who knows that he has a certain tendency of which he disapproves. He doesn't identify with it. And he thinks that if he knows he has this tendency, then he's forewarned and forearmed against it, and maybe he can resist it.
Yes.
And to resist it would be, in the simplest possible form, to not act on it,
yes.
and then perhaps even to try to suppress the feeling. But why I said try to overcome it is there's an obvious limit to one's success in this kind of thing.
Yes.
I mean, we were talking at the beginning about the scope of moral freedom. I mean, it's not just free to act or free to alter one's feelings.
Yes.
But I mean, to say to somebody, well, fine, you've done the right thing, now let's have the right feelings behind it next time. I mean,
Yes.
I mean,
Yes, I mean, certainly one's overconfidence in one's ability to alter oneself can be just as much a cause of disaster as simply regarding oneself as unalterable and not wanting to know.
Well, about that, I mean, about self-knowledge, I mean, there are just 2 points I'd like to make. I mean, one is that there's a very big difference between the kind of self-knowledge that Hampshire's talking about, that you were alluding to, that is knowing what one's likely to do and being perhaps forewarned against it, so that one knows the kind of temptation that's likely to come. That's very different from the kind of self-knowledge which I suppose an analysis aims at, which isn't just a description of one's character as it is, but a sort of quasi-historical inquiry designed to unravel complications which cause conflict at the time when...
Well, the two things merge into each other, don't they, really?
Very different.
I mean,
I might know, as it were, all about my tendencies, and yet find them utterly obscure, and feel that many of my feelings were judged by ordinary human standards quite inappropriate to their objects. And of course it is in this situation that people often begin to undergo analysis.
But I still feel that one needn't really put self-knowledge and the kind of freedom which is connected with this sort of self-knowledge into such a central position. I mean, that there are many other, as it were, sources of enlightenment in human life. I mean, there are the sources of enlightenment which are connected with religion and art, which very often don't involve any particular theory at all, or at any rate, certainly not that kind of theory, about the structure of the self, as it were. I mean, I think that...
I'm not saying that's the only thing, but just that it is a very important thing. But to go back, in Hampshire's theory, which of course develops out of study of psychoanalytic theory, the point of self-knowledge is that you're better informed I mean, you just have not only information about the situation you're going to be in, but about the situation which your own character creates for you. Then, his idea is your will is detached from all this material and can take, as it were, an executive decision. But the effects of self-knowledge, insofar as analysis aims at self-knowledge, is something much more obscure and complicated. I mean, it's designed to actually shift people's feelings, focus them onto different objects.
I mean,
it's not in any way connected with an act of will. I mean, it isn't as if somebody goes to me and says, right, now you've told me everything, now I'll go home and decide what to do about it. I mean, it's absolutely not like that. So I think that there is a very big difference.
Yes, I would, I mean, and this is where, again, I think we disagree, and we have discussed this before. I wouldn't regard what happens in analysis as necessarily properly described as self-knowledge at all. I mean, I think it's a manipulation of the psyche, which very often would not properly be called knowing something which pre-existed, but rather bringing into being something, at any rate, slightly different.
One of your deep objection to Freudian theory is that it is based on determinism, and that you do regard the action of the analyst as somehow interfering with a mechanism which really ought to be able to be self-regulating.
I feel with a theory such as that of Stuart Hampshire, which arises partly out of a background interest in say, in Freud, that one's being offered as a value in itself the notion of having a larger area of choice and of having a greater knowledge of a certain type of one situation. And I don't see that this assumption need necessarily be made. I mean, I think perhaps it might be one value among others, but not a kind of compulsory one. That is, I would think that there are many other things, such as the quality of one's attachment to one's surroundings, one's relations with one's family, one's relations to religion and art, and so on, where it's very difficult to find the right words here, but where the, as it were, intensity of one's interest has a morally enriching quality.
Well, I mean, what you're really talking about is not the kind of self-knowledge that you get through psychoanalysis, but the kind of self-knowledge which you get in a rather perhaps simpler way by reflecting on your own character and what you normally do, what you're likely to do, and so on. And that's what Hampshire is talking about. I think that's what you have in mind. Hampshire's point is that that kind of self-knowledge always enlarges freedom, because it gives you, his idea is, it widens your scope for effective choice. As it were, you're less likely to be taken by surprise by yourself.
Yes, well, yes, yes, all right. I mean, at some point one draws a line, I don't know, but at some point, let's say, a line can be drawn between ordinary kinds of self-knowledge, things you could discover without the assistance of an expert, as it were, and what's happening in analysis.
Well, the self-knowledge acquired, if it is acquired for analysis, is of course genetic. I mean, it's essentially connected with the history of the development of your emotions. Whereas the other kind, I mean, is just contemporary. I mean, you could imagine a person who had complete knowledge of what he was likely to do in any situation.
I don't feel in any way anxious about determinism. If one thinks here of the spectre of determinism rising up, as it must do in the background, if one wishes to take a semi-scientific view of the mind, if one wants to regard the mind as a machine out of which we either can or can't step, and Hampshire, of course, who is not a determinist, thinks that it's a great advantage. If you realize how machine-like your mind is, you then take this into account, and you're even more free than you would have been otherwise. But somebody might say, well, if there's so much machinery, aren't you afraid that the machinery will take you in as well? I don't myself feel anxious about this. I mean, I'm not a determinist, and I don't really think that determinism can be framed as a philosophical theory. I mean, I think it's a sort of spectre. It's a kind of extension over a total area of something which only has sense, that I take a kind of Kantian limitation view of the possibility of framing the theory of determinism.
the whole question of the Wittgenstein's views on privacy is it's an enormous and complicated question.